Hey guys, it's Cassidy again, and today we're going to read part 13 of Cinder by Marissa Meyer. And a quick disclaimer, if you hear anything weird like that, it's my bird. She's pretty loud today. But anyway, chapter 34. The ballroom temperature spiked as hundreds of faces turned toward Cinder. Perhaps the crowd would have turned away a moment later, indifferent, if they hadn't found the Emperor's personal guest to be a girl with damp hair and mud splatters on the hem of her wrinkled silver dress. As it was, the gazes halted, pinning Cinder to the top of the stairs. Her mismatched feet stuck to the landing as if concrete hardened around them. She looked at Kai, his jaw hanging as he took her in. He'd expected her to come the entire time. He'd reserved a spot for her as his personal guest. She could only imagine how he was regretting that decision now. Beside him, Pearl's face had begun to burn underneath the glowing chandeliers. Cinder looked at her stepsister, at Adri, took in their speechless mortification, and reminded herself to breathe. It was already over for her. Pearl had almost certainly told Kai she was cyborg. Soon, Queen Lavanna would see her too, and know she was lunar. She would be taken away, maybe killed. There was nothing she could do about it now. But she had taken the risk. She had made the decision to come, and it would not go to waste. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. Gathering up the full silk skirt, she fixed her gaze on Kai and made her way slowly down the steps. Her eyes softened into something almost like amusement, as if such a ragged appearance was all one would expect from a renowned mechanic. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the heel of Cinder's boot hit the marble floor with forced precision, the sea of gowns began to shuffle aside. Women whispered behind their hands. Men craned their necks to catch the hushed gossip. Even the servants had stopped to watch her, holding trays of delicacies aloft. The scent of garlic and ginger clouded around them, twisting Cinder's stomach into knots. She realized suddenly how famous she was. All the preparations for running away had left little time for eating. Coupled with her anxiety, it almost made her feel faint. She did her best to ignore it, to be strong. But nervousness was expanding through her taut muscles with every step. Her pulse was a drumbeat inside her head. Every eye swept over her, mocking her. Every head turned to whisper, rumors already taking flight. Cinder's ears rang, picking snatches of conversation. A personal guest, but who is she? And what is that stuff on her dress? Until Cinder adjusted the audio interface, silencing the words. Never in her life had she been so glad she couldn't blush. Kai's lips twitched, and though he still looked baffled, he didn't look angry or disgusted. Cinder gulped. As she got nearer, her arms burned to wrap around herself, to cover her filthy, wrinkled, water-stained dress as best she could, but she didn't allow them. It would have been futile, and Kai didn't care about her dress. If anything, he was probably trying to discern how much of her was metal and silicone. She kept her head held high, even as her eyes stung, even as her panic filled her vision with warnings and precautions. It wasn't her fault he had liked her. It was not her fault she was cyborg, so she would not apologize. She focused only on walking, one thudding step after another, as the crowd parted before her, then closed again in her wake. But before she could reach the Emperor, a figure pushed out of the crowd and into her path. Cinder froze, halted by the seething glare of her stepmother. She blinked, dumbfounded, as reality stumbled in on the still, silent moment. She'd forgotten that Adri and Pearl were there. Blotchy red cheeks showed through Adri's translucent white makeup, and her chest was heaving beneath the modest neckline of her kimono. The confused tittering hushed, pushing the questions toward those in the back of the crowd who couldn't see what was happening but could no doubt feel the tension expanding around them. Adri's hand snatched forward, capturing Cinder's skirt in her fist. She shook the material. "Where did you get this?" she hissed, her voice low, as if she were afraid of causing more of a scene than Cinder already had. Setting her jaw, Cinder stepped back, whipping the dress away from her stepmother. "Eco saved the dress. Peony would have wanted me to have it." Behind her mother, Pearl gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Cinder glanced at her and found Pearl looking at her feet with horror. Cinder shuddered, imagining her cyborg leg visible for all to see, until Pearl pointed at her feet and shrieked, "My boots! Those are my boots! On her!" Adri's eyes narrowed. "You little thief! How dare you come here and make a mockery of this family?" She jutted her finger over Cinder's shoulder toward the grand staircase. "I command you to go home this instant before you embarrass me further." "No," she said, clenching her fists. "I have as much right to be here as you do." "What, you?" Adri's voice started to rise. "But you're nothing but a—" She caught her tongue, even now unwilling to share the mortifying secret about her stepdaughter. Instead, she raised her hand over her shoulder, palm flat. The crowd gasped and Cinder flinched, but the strike did not come. Kai stood beside her stepmother, one hand wrapped firmly around Adri's wrist. Adri turned to him, her face burning with anger, but the look quickly fell away. She shriveled back, stammering, "Your Majesty." "That is enough," he said, his voice gentle but stern, and released her. Adri shrank into a pathetic curtsy, head bowing. "I'm so sorry, Your Majesty. This girl is. I'm so sorry she's interrupted. She's my ward, and she shouldn't be here." "Of course she should." There was a lightness to his words, as if he believed his presence alone could dissolve Adri's hostility. He fixed his gaze on Cinder. "She's my personal guest." He glanced around over the heads of the shocked audience, toward the stage where the symphony had gone silent. "This is a night for celebration and amusement," he said loudly. "Please let the dancing resume." The band started, shakily at first, until music again filled the ballroom. Cinder couldn't recall when it had died out, but her hearing was still dulled to the swarming noise around her. Kai was looking at her again. She gulped and found that she was shaking, with anger and terror and nerves and the sensation of being captured by his brown eyes. Her mind was blank, not yet sure if she wanted to thank him or turn away and keep yelling at her stepmother, but he didn't give her a chance to do either. Kai reached forward and took her hand, and before she realized what was happening, he had plucked her away from her stepmother and stepsister and taken her into his arms. They were dancing. Heart hammering, Cinder pried her gaze away from him and looked over his shoulder. They were the only ones dancing. Kai must have noticed it too, for he floated his hand briefly away from her waist, gesturing it to the gawking crowd, and said in a tone that was part encouragement and part command, "Please, you are my guest. Enjoy the music." Awkwardly, those nearby traded glances with their own partners, and soon the floor was filling with bustled skirts and coattails. Cinder risked glancing toward where they had abandoned Adrian and Pearl, but they were both standing amid the shuffling crowd, watching as Kai expertly guided Cinder further and further away from them. Clearing his throat, Kai murmured, "You have no idea how to dance, do you?" Cinder fixed her gaze on him, mind still reeling. "I'm a mechanic." His eyebrows raised mockingly. "Believe me, I noticed. Are those grease stains on the gloves I gave you?" Mortified, she glanced at their intertwined fingers and the black smudges on her white silk gloves. Before she could apologize, she felt herself being gently pushed away and spun beneath his arm. She gasped, for a moment feeling light as a butterfly, before she stumbled on her undersized cyborg foot and fell back into his embrace. Kai grinned, coaxing her back into arm's length, but he didn't tease her. "So, that's your stepmother. Legal guardian. Right, my mistake. She seemed like a real treasure." Cinder scoffed and her body started to ease. Without sensation in her foot, it felt like trying to dance with a ball of iron soldered to her ankle. Her leg was beginning to ache from carrying it, but she just resisted the urge to limp, picturing ever graceful Pearl in her ball gown and heels, and wished her body into conformity. At least her body seemed to be memorizing the pattern of the dance steps, making each movement slightly more fluid than the last, until she felt almost as if she knew what she was doing. Of course, the tender pressure of Kai's hand on her waist didn't hurt. "I'm sorry about that," she said. "About her and my stepsister. Can you believe they think I'm the embarrassment?" She made it sound like a joke, but she couldn't help analyzing his response, bracing for that moment when he asked her if it were true, if she were really cyborg. Then, as his smile started to crumple, she realized the moment had come far too soon, and she desperately wished she could take the moment back. She wished they could go on pretending forever that her secret was still safe, that he didn't know, that he still wanted her to be his personal guest. "Why didn't you tell me?" Kai said, his voice lowering even though the noise of laughter and tapping heels filled the air around them. Cinder opened her mouth, but her words snagged in her throat. She wanted to refute Pearl's claim to call her liar, but what would that get her? More lies, more betrayal. The fingers of her hand tightened on his shoulder, the hard, unforgiving confines of the limb. He didn't flinch, just waited. She wanted to feel relief now that they had no more secrets, but that wasn't entirely true either. He still didn't know she was lunar. She opened her mouth again, unsure what she was going to say until the faint words came to her. "I didn't know how." Kai's eyes softened, like little wrinkles forming in their corners. "I would have understood," he said. Almost imperceptibly, he inched closer, and Cinder found her elbow crawling up his shoulder in a way that felt impossibly natural. Still, she didn't back away, didn't shudder or tense. He knew, but he wasn't disgusted. He would still touch her. She felt, somehow unbelievably still like her. She felt she would have cried if it had been an option. Her fingertips tentatively curled around the hair at the back of his neck, and she found that she was shaking. Sure he would push her away at any moment, but he didn't. His lips parted just barely, and Cinder wondered if maybe she wasn't the only one having trouble breathing. It's just she started running her tongue across her lips. It isn't something I like to talk about. I haven't told anyone who didn't know her. Cinder's words evaporated. Her? Fingers stiffening, she eased them out of his hair and settled her palm back on his shoulder. The intensity in his gaze melted into sympathy. I understand why he didn't say anything, but now I feel so selfish. His jaw flexed, his brow turned up with guilt. I know I should have guessed after you told me she was sick to begin with. But with the coronation and Queen Lavana's visit and the ball, I guess I forgot. I know that makes me the biggest jerk in the world, and I should have realized that your sister had, and why you're ignoring my calls. It all makes sense now. I just wish you would have told me. Her gaze shifted over his shoulder, focusing on nothing. I know, she murmured. I should have told you. She felt as though all her synthetic parts were squeezing together, crushing her insides. Kai didn't know. And yet to have felt the comforting presence of acceptance, only to be confined by secrecy again, was even more unbearable than lying to him to begin with. Kai, she said, shaking herself from the misery that threatened her. She pushed back to arm's length, returning them to the acceptable distance of strangers, or of a mechanic dancing with her emperor. I came here to tell you something. It's important. She glanced around, ensuring that no one could hear them. Though she caught a few jealous scowls targeting her, no one was close enough to hear over the music, and the Lunar Queen was nowhere to be seen. Listen, you can't marry Lavana, no matter what she wants, no matter what she threatens. Kai flushed at the Queen's name. What do you want? What do you mean? She doesn't want the Commonwealth. She's going to start a war with Earth either way. It's just that being Empress here will pave the way for her. It was his turn to look around, simultaneously molding his look of panic into cool indifference, though up close, Cinder could see the worry in his eyes. And there's more. She does know about Ninety, about what she found out. She knows you were trying to find Princess Celine, and she's taken the information you found and is hunting her down now. She has people out looking for her, if they haven't found her already. Eyes widening, Kai looked back at her. And you know, she continued, not allowing him to interrupt, you know that she won't forgive you for trying to find the princess. She gulped. Kai, as soon as you marry her and she has what she wants, she's going to kill you. The color drained from his face. How do you know all this? She took in a deep breath, somehow exhausted from getting all the information out, as if she'd only reserved enough energy to bring her to this moment. The decom chip I found in 9Z. There was this girl, its programmer. It's complicated. She hesitated, thinking she should give the chip to Kai when she had the chance. He may be able to get more information out of the girl, except in her hurry to leave for the ball, she'd stashed it in her calf compartment. Her gut sank. To retrieve it now would reveal herself to everyone around her. She gulped, shoving aside the rising distress. Was saving her own pride more important to her? Is there somewhere we can go? She asked, away from the crowd. I'll tell you everything. He glanced around. In their dancing, they had traveled almost the entire length of the ballroom, and they now stood before a set of massive doors that opened out into the royal gardens. Beyond the steps, a willow tree was weeping from the heavy rain, a koi pond nearly overflowing. The pummeling of the storm came in waves, almost drowning out the noise of the orchestra. The gardens, he said, but before he could move, a shadow fell across them. Glancing up, Cinder saw the unhappy expression of a royal official, looking at Kai with lips so tight they started to go white. He did not acknowledge Cinder. Your Majesty, he said, his face drawn. It's time. Chapter 35. Cinder looked up at the man, her link to the net database informing her that he was Contourin, royal advisor. Time, she said, turning back to Kai. Time for what? Kai stared at her, part apologetic, part afraid. Her gut twisted. Time to seal the fate of the Eastern Commonwealth. No, she insisted. Kai, you can't. Your Majesty, said Contourin, without deigning to meet Cinder's eye. I've allowed you your freedom, but it's time to put an end to this. You are embarrassing yourself. Kai let his gaze fall before shutting his eyes altogether. He rubbed at his brow. Just a moment. I need a moment to think. We do not have a moment. We have been over this time and time again. There's new information, Kai said, his tone harsh. Contourin's face darkened, and he cast a suspicious glare at Cinder. She shivered at the disapproving frown. For once, this was hatred directed at her, not because she was a cyborg, but because she was a normal girl unworthy of attention of the Emperor. For once, she couldn't disagree. If the understanding showed on her face, the advisor ignored it. Your Majesty, with all due respect, you no longer have the luxury of being a lovesick teenager. You have a duty to fulfill. to your people now. Dropping his hand, Kai met Gontorn's gaze. His eyes hollow. I know, he said. I'll do what is best for them. Cinder gathered up the material of her skirt in both hands, hope stirring inside her. He understood her warnings. He understood the mistake he would be making if he agreed to marry Levana. She had succeeded. But then he turned toward her, and the hope shattered at seeing the helplessness etched in deep eyes across his brow. Thank you for warning me, Cinder. At least I won't be going into this blindly. She shook her head. Kai, you can't. I don't have a choice. She has an army that could destroy us, an antidote we need. I have to take my chances. Cinder stumbled back as if his words had landed the blow that he had protected her from. He was going to marry Queen Levana. Queen Levana would be empress. I'm sorry, Cinder. He looked as crushed as Cinder felt, and while her body became heavy and immovable, Kai somehow found the strength to turn away with head lifted and started walking toward the platform at the far end of the ballroom. She searched her brain for anything she could do to change his mind, but what else was there? He knew Levana would still start a war. He knew Levana would probably try to kill him after the wedding. He probably knew more about cruel and evil deeds she'd committed than Cinder did, and none of it made a difference. Somehow he was still naive enough to think that more good than bad could come from the union. He would not stop it from happening. A fist clenched over Cinder's heart. Before she knew what she was doing, she was storming after Kai. She grabbed his elbow and spun him back around to face her. Without hesitating, Cinder wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. Kai froze, his body as tense as an android's against her, but his lips were soft and warm. Though Cinder had intended for it to be a short kiss, she found herself lingering. Hot tingles coursed through her body, surprising and scary but not unpleasant, surging like electricity through her wires. This time they did not overwhelm her. This time they didn't threaten to burn her from the inside out. The desperation melted, and, for the briefest of moments, the ulterior motives were gone. She found herself kissing him for no other reason than she wanted to. She wanted him to know that she wanted to. She didn't realize how badly she wanted Kai to kiss her back until it became quite clear that he wouldn't. Cinder pried herself away. Her hands lingered on his shoulders, still shaking from the raw energy inside her. Kai gaped at her, and though Cinder's gut reaction was to back away and apologize profusely, she swallowed it down. Perhaps, she said, testing her voice before raising it loud enough that she was sure the crowd would hear her. Perhaps the Queen will not accept your proposal once she finds out you're already in love with me. Kai's eyebrows rose higher. What? Beside him, the advisor took in a hissing breath, and a series of gasps and rustles passed through the crowd. It occurred to Cinder that the music had stopped again. A burst of jovial, tittering laughter split through the awkwardness. The sound, though filled with the sweetness of a child's giggle, sent a chill down Cinder's spine. Pulling her gaze away from Kai's neck, she slowly turned. The crowd followed the noise as well, swiveling in unison like puppets on strings. And there was Queen Levana. She was leaning against one of the columns that flanked the doorway to the gardens, holding a goblet of gold wine in one hand and pressing the fingers of the other against her smiling red lips. Her figure was perfection. Her posture couldn't have been more poised if she'd been carved from the same stone as the pillar. She wore a royal blue dress that shimmered with what were probably diamonds, yet gave the very distinct impression of stars on an endless summer sky. The orange light blinked beside Cinder's vision, the Queen's glamour, the endless light. In addition to the Queen, a lunar guard stood just within the doorway, stark red hair swept up from his brow like a candle flame. A man and woman dressed in the distinctive uniforms of royal thaumaturges also lingered nearby, awaiting their mistress's order. Every one of them was strikingly beautiful, and, unlike their queen, their beauty didn't seem to be an illusion. Cinder wondered if that was a requirement for serving the lunar throne, or if she just happened to be the only lunar in the galaxy who hadn't been born with brilliant eyes and flawless skin. How charmingly naive, said the Queen, followed by another spill of laughter. You misunderstand my culture. On Luna we consider monogamy to be nothing more than archaic sentimentality. What do I care if my husband to be is in love with another? She paused, her dark eyes sweeping over Cinder's dress. Woman? Terror wrapped around Cinder's throat as the Queen's eyes seemed to pierce right through her. The Queen knew she was lunar, she could tell. What does concern me, continued Queen Levana, her voice a sweet lullaby sharpened with her next words, is that it appears my betrothed has fallen in love with an insignificant shell. Am I mistaken? The thaumaturges nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on Cinder. She certainly has the smell of one, said the woman. Cinder wrinkled her nose. According to Dr. Erland, she wasn't actually a shell, and she wondered if the woman was making that insult up to mock her, or maybe she was smelling the gasoline fumes from the car. Suddenly her net length recognized the woman, and Cinder forgot about the affront. She was the diplomat who had been in New Beijing for weeks, whose picture had been all over the news feeds, though she never paid her much attention. Sybil Mira, head thaumaturge to the Lunar Queen. Mistress Sybil, the girl had said over the decom chip. This was the woman who had forced her to make the spy equipment, who had put the chip in 9Z. Cinder tried to relax, to surprise that her control panel hadn't short-circuited with all the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Kai abandoned Cinder, marching toward the Queen. Your Majesty, I apologize for this disruption, he said, but we do not need to make a scene in front of my guests. The Queen's charcoal eyes flashed with the warm ballroom light. It seems you're perfectly capable of making a scene without my help. Her smile turned to a playful pout. Oh dear, it seems that I'm more hurt than I thought I was by your fickleness. I believed I was to be your personal guest tonight. Again her eyes caressed Cinder's face. You can't think you're prettier than me. She reached out a fingernail and traced it along Kai's jaw. My dear, are you blushing? Kai slapped Levana's hand away, but before he could respond, she turned toward Cinder and her expression filled with disgust. What is your name, child? Cinder downed a painful gulp, barely forcing her name from her throat. Cinder. Cinder? A condescending laugh. How fitting. Ashes, dirt, filth. That's enough, started Kai, but Levana breezed past him, the sparkling dress swaying over her hips. She held her wine glass aloft, as if prepared to compliment the prince on such a pleasant dinner party. Tell me, Cinder, she said, what poor sapling urchin did you steal that name from? Cinder's hand went to her wrist and gripped the silk glove and flesh that concealed her ID chip, barely sore from the small incision she made earlier. A weight settled in the pit of her stomach. The Queen sniffed. You shells, she said, her voice rising for the crowd. You think you're so clever. So you stole a chip from a dead Earthen's wrist. So you managed to slip into the government system. So you think you pass as human, that you can exist here without any repercussions. You are fools. Cinder clenched her jaw. She wanted to explain that she had no memory of being anything but Earthen, anything but cyborg. But who would she be pleading her case to? Certainly not the Queen. And Kai, who was tossing glances between her and the Queen, trying to fit the puzzle pieces of Levana's words together in his head. The Queen turned back to the Emperor. Not only harboring Lunars, but also cavorting with them. I'm disappointed in you, Your Majesty. She clucked her tongue. The fact that this girl lives within your borders proves that you are in violation of the interplanetary agreement. I take the blatant disregard of such a statute quite seriously, Emperor Kaido. In fact, I could warrant a call to war. I insist that this traitor must be taken into captivity and returned to Luna immediately. A second Lunar stepped out of the crowd, equally as handsome as the others, with blonde hair and serious, ice-blue eyes. Without warning, he grasped Cinder's wrist, pinning them behind her. She gasped, her gaze flying wildly toward the gathered audience as alarmed cries rippled through it. Stop! Kai rushed toward Cinder and grabbed her elbow. He tugged her toward him and she stumbled, but the guard didn't loosen his grip. The guard pulled Cinder back again, and her arm, made slippery by the silk gloves, was torn from Kai's grip. She found herself plastered against the Lunar. His chest was solid behind her, and a faint hum buzzed in her head, like static electricity in her hair. Magic, she realized. Bioelectricity humming inside him. Could everyone hear it from so close, or was this just another sign of her awakening gift? Let her go, Kai said, appealing to the Queen. This is absurd. She isn't a fugitive. She isn't even Lunar. She's just a mechanic. Levana quirked one slender eyebrow. Well, Cinder, said Queen Levana, twirling at the pale wine. It seems you've been keeping secrets from your royal superiors. Do you wish to refute my claim? Kai turned toward her, and she could sense his desperation, even if she couldn't look at him. She focused only on the Queen, her jaw aching with hatred. She was glad that no tears would betray her humiliation, glad that no blood in her cheeks would betray her anger, glad that her hateful cyborg body was good for one thing as she clutched onto her shredded dignity. She leveled her glare at the Queen. If I had not been brought to Earth, she said, I would be a slave under your rule. I will not apologize for escaping. In the corner of her eye, she saw Kai's face fall, eyes widening as the truth became undeniable. He'd been courting a lunar. A cry rang out from the trembling crowd. Arana gasped a soft thud. Adria had fainted. Gulping, Cinder squared her shoulders. "I want no apologies," said Lavana, flashing a wicked smile. "I only want to see the wrongs of your life righted, swiftly and surely. You want to see me dead." How bright she is. Yes, I do, and not just you, but all those like you. You shells are a threat to society, a danger to our ideal culture. Because you can't brainwash us into worshipping you like everyone else. The Queen's lips tightened, hardening like plaster on her face. Her voice fell, chilling the room. A sudden burst of rain behind her shook the windows. "It's not only for my people, but for Earthens as well. You shells are a plague. Quite literally, it seems." "My queen," said the dark-haired woman, refers to your so-called blue fever that has wreaked such havoc on your citizens. And of course your own royal family. May Emperor Riken rest in. What does that have to do with anything?" said Kai. The woman tucked her hands into the bell-shaped sleeves of her ivory coat. "Hadn't your brilliant scientists drawn that conclusion yet? Many ungifted lunars are carriers of letimosis. They brought it to Earth, and continue to spread it without concern for the lives they are taking." Cinder shook her head. "No," she said. Kai turned to her, unconsciously taking a step away. She shook her head more harshly. "They don't know they're doing it. How could they? And, of course, the scientists have figured it out, but what can they do other than try to find a cure?" The Queen laughed sharply. "Ignorance is your defense? How trite. You must see the truth, the fact that you should be dead. It'd be so much better for everyone if you were. And for the record," said Cinder, her voice rising, "I'm not a shell." The Queen smirked, unconvinced. That's enough," said Kai. "I don't care where she was born. Cinder is a citizen of the Commonwealth. I will not have her arrested." Sylvana did not tear her gaze from Cinder. "Harboring a fugitive is grounds for war, young Emperor. You know this." Cinder's visibility dimmed as her retina cascaded a nonsensical diagram of her eyesight. She slammed her eyes shut, cursing. Now was not the time for a brain malfunction. "But perhaps," said the Queen, "we can reach some sort of a compromise." Cinder opened her eyes. The darkened film remained, but the muddy diagram was gone. She focused on the Queen just in time to see a cruel tilt of her lips. "This girl seems to think you love her, and here's your chance to prove it." She dipped her lashes. "So tell me, your Majesty, are you prepared to bargain for her?" Chapter 36. "Bargain," said Kai. "For her life? Welcome to the world of true politics." Ivana took a sip of her wine. Despite the blood-red lips, no mark was left on the glass. "This is not the time or place to be having this discussion," he said with a barely restrained growl. "Isn't it? It seems to me that this discussion involves every being in this room. After all, you all want peace. You want to keep your citizenry safe. Those are admirable goals." Her gaze slid to Cinder. "You also want to save this hapless creature. So be it." "And you," said Kai. "I want to be Empress." Cinder squirmed against the guard. "No, Kai, you can't do it." He turned back toward her. His eyes were turbulent. "It won't make a difference," Cinder said. "You know it won't." "Silence her," ordered Lavana. The guard clamped a hand over her mouth, pulling her hard against his chest. But he couldn't keep her eyes from pleading. "Don't do it. I'm not worth it. You know that." Kai paced to the doorway. He gazed out at the raging storm for a moment, his shoulders quaking, before he turned and swept his gaze over the ballroom. The annual ball, 126 years of world peace. He released a strangled breath and pulled his shoulders taut. "I thought I'd made my decision quite clear. Only hours ago, I told my country that I'd do anything to keep them safe. Anything at all." He opened both palms, pleading, toward the Queen. "I acknowledge readily that you are more powerful than all earthen kingdoms combined, and I have no desire to test our forces against yours. I also recognize that I am ignorant in the ways of your culture and your people, and I can't condemn you for the way you govern them. I trust you have always had the best interests of your people at heart." He met Cinder's gaze. His shoulders became rigid. "It is not the way that I will have the Commonwealth governed. We must have peace, but not at the expense of freedom. I cannot marry you." The air sucked out of the room. Low rushed whispers scattering in the crowd. Relief swelled in Cinder, but it was squashed when Kai met her gaze. And he couldn't have looked more miserable. He mouthed simply, "I'm sorry." She wished she could tell him it was all right. She understood. This was the decision she wanted him to make from the start, and nothing would change that. She was not worth starting a war over. Queen Lavana's lips were pinched, her face static before the slow drawing back of her ears. the almost imperceptible clenching of her jaw. Cinder's retina scanner flickered madly in the corner of her sight, scrolling through numbers and bits of data, but she ignored it like she would an annoying gnat. You made your decision? Yes, said Kai. The fugitive will be held in our prison until your departure. He lifted his chin as if reconciling himself to the decision. I've meant no respect, Your Majesty. I do wish that with all my heart we can continue our discussions for an acceptable alliance. We cannot, said Lavana. The glass in her hand shattered, sending bits of crystal cascading to the hard floor. Cinder jumped. A chorus of screaming burst from the crowd as they drew back, but the lunar guard seemed immune to the outburst. My requirements were made quite clear to your father, as they have been made quite clear to you, and you are a fool to deny them. She tossed the glass's thin stem at the column. Wine dribbled from her fingertips. Do you insist on denying my request? Your Majesty, answer the question. Cinder's retina scanner lit up, as if a spotlight had been dropped down on the queen. She gasped. Her knees collapsed, and she slumped against the guard, who jerked her back upright. She shut her eyes, sure she was imagining things, then opened them again. The diagram realigned, lines pinpointing the exact angles of Lavana's face, coordinates showing the placement of her eyes, the length of her nose, the width of her brow. A perfect illustration overlaid the perfect woman, and they were not the same. Cinder was still gawking at the queen, trying to make sense of the lines and angles that her scanner was showing her, when she realized that her arguing had ceased. Her reaction had been so abrupt that everyone's attention had to return to her. Stars, she whispered. Her scanner was seeing beyond the illusion. Unscathed by the lunar glamour, it knew where the true boundaries of the queen's face were, the imperfections and inconsistencies. It really is an illusion. You're not beautiful. The queen paled. The world seemed to have frozen around the diagrams in Cinder's gaze, the tiny points and measurements revealing the queen's greatest secret. She could still see the queen's glamour, her high cheekbones and full lips, but the effect was hidden beneath the truth of the diagram. The longer she stared, the more data her display gathered, gradually filling in Lavana's true features. She was so entranced by the slow revealing that she didn't notice Lavana curling her long fingers at her side. It was not until an electric current seemed to shimmer in the air that Cinder snapped her focus away from scribbling in her vision. The queen flexed her fingers. The guard pulled away, releasing Cinder's wrists. Planting her feet, Cinder barely caught herself from toppling forward, at the same time that her hand reached back, as if with a mind of its own, and snatched the gun from the guard's holster. She stiffened, feeling the heavy gun so abruptly, unexpectedly in her steel hand. Her finger slipped over the trigger as if it were an extension of her. The gun felt uncomfortable in her palm, but it shouldn't have. She'd never held one before. Her heart thudded. Oh, it felt comfortable in her palm, but it shouldn't have. Her heart thudded. Cinder lifted the gun, pressing the barrel against her own temple. A shuddering cry escaped her. A strand of hair clung to her parched lips. Her eyes darted to the left, unable to see the gun or the traitor's hand holding it. She looked to the queen, the crowd, to Kai. Her whole body was shaking, but for the confident arm holding the gun poised to kill her. No, leave her alone. Kai rushed for her, grasping her elbow. He tried to yank it away, but she was immobilized, solid as a statue. Let her go. Kai, she stammered, terror seizing her. She urged the hand to drop the gun, urged her finger to pull away from the trigger, but it was useless. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her head throbbed. Increasing levels of adrenaline, cortisone, glucose, heart rate increasing, blood pressure increasing. Warning, warning. Her finger twitched briefly, then solidified again. She imagined what the gun would sound like. She imagined the blood. She imagined her brain shutting down, feeling nothing. Bioelectrical manipulation detected. Initializing resistance procedure in 3, 2. Her finger slowly pulled down on the trigger. Fire exploded in her spine, racing along her nerves and wires, slithering down the metal braces in her limbs. Cinder screamed and forced the gun away from her hand. Arm straight, barrel pointed at the ceiling. She stopped fighting it, pulled the trigger. A chandelier shattered above her, glass and crystals and sparks. The crowd screamed and searched for the exit. Cinder crumpled to her knees and doubled over, cradling the gun against her stomach. Pain tore through her, blinding her. Fireworks burst in her head. It felt as if her body were trying to dispel all her cyborg parts, explosions and sparks and smoke tearing at her flesh. Kai's voice over the tumult in her ears made her realize that the pain was subsiding. She felt hot to the touch, like someone had thrown her into a kiln, but the pain and heat had moved to her exterior, to her skin and fingertips, rather than eating her up inside. She opened her eyes. White spots speckled her gaze. Her display was flashing red lights. Diagnostics rolled through the corner of her vision. Her temperature was too high, her heart rate too high, blood pressure too high. Some foreign substance had invaded her blood that her system didn't recognize and couldn't dispel. Something is wrong, her programming screamed at her. You are sick, you are ill, you're dying. But she didn't feel like she was dying. Her body felt so hot that she was surprised she didn't incinerate the fragile dress. Sweat sizzled on her brow. She felt indifferent, strong. Oh, she felt different, strong, powerful, on fire. Shaking, she sat back on her heels and stared at her hands. The left glove had started to melt, forming patches of gooey, silky skin on her white-hot metal hand. She could see electricity sizzling through the steel surface, but she couldn't tell if it was her human or cyborg eyes detecting it. Or maybe not human or cyborg. Maybe lunar. She raised her head. The world was covered in a cool gray mist as if everything had frozen except for her. Her body was beginning to cool, her skin paling, her metal dulling. She tried to cover her metal hand stupidly, in case Kai had been too blinded by the flash to notice it. She caught the Queen's eye. Levana's rage seemed to hiccup when their gazes met. The Queen gasped and drew back a step. For a moment she looked afraid. Impossible, she whispered. Cinder called forth every nanobyte of strength she possessed in order to stand, and pointed the gun at the Queen. She pulled the trigger. The red-haired guard was there. The bullet bit him in the shoulder. Levana didn't even flinch. Cinder's brain caught up with her body as blood dripped over the guard's armor. Cinder dropped the gun and ran. Knowing the frenzied crowd was impenetrable, she barreled toward the nearest exit, the massive doors that led into the gardens. Past the guard, past the Queen, past her entourage, glass crunching beneath her stolen boots. The hollow echo of the stone patio, a puddle splashing in her legs. Onto her legs, the fresh, cool smell of rain that had turned to a drizzle. The stairway stretched before her. 12 steps in a Zen garden, a towering wall, a gate, the city, escape. On the 5th step, she heard the bolt snap. The wires tore loose, like tendons stretched to the max. She felt the loss of power at the base of her calf, sending a blinding warning light signal up to her brain. She fell screaming and tried to block her fall with her left hand. A shock of pain jolted up her shoulder and into her spine. Metal clattered against stone as she crashed down onto the gravel pathway. She lay sprawled on her side. Blood stained the beautiful cream-colored silk over her right elbow. She struggled to breathe. Her head felt suddenly heavy, but she let it slump to the ground, little pebbles digging into her scalp. She squinted up at the sky, where the storm had fizzled out but for a foggy mist that clung to Cinder's hair and gaze, refreshing against her hot skin. The full moon sought to break through the cloud cover, burning a slow hole above her as if it planned to swallow up the whole sky. Movement drew her back to the ballroom. The guard who had been holding her reached the stairs and froze. Kai was beside him a second later and screeched to a halt, grasping the railing to stop himself. His eyes drunk her in, a gleam of metal fingers, the wire sparking at the ends of her battered metal leg. His jaw fell, and he looked momentarily as if he might be sick. More pounding at the top of the stairs. The man and woman appeared in their thaumaturge uniforms, and the guard she shot, undeterred by his oozing wound. Kai's advisor, and finally Queen Levana herself. Her glamour had returned to full force, but all her beauty couldn't hide the fury contorting her features. Gathering her sparkling skirt in both hands, she moved to stomp down the steps toward Cinder, but the lady thaumaturge stopped her with a gentle hand and gestured up to the wall of the palace. Cinder followed the movement. The security camera was on them, on her, seeing everything. The last remnants of strength fled from Cinder, leaving her exhausted and weak. Kai crept down the stairs as if sneaking up on a wounded animal. Stooping, he picked up the rusted cyborg foot that had fallen out of the velvet boot. His jaw flexed as he studied it, perhaps recognizing it from the day they'd met at the market. He wouldn't look at her. Levana's lips curled. Disgusting, she said from the doorway, safely hidden from the camera's view. Her words were loud and unnatural. Her words were loud and unnaturally forced compared to her usual lilting voice. Death would be merciful. She wasn't a shell after all, said Sybil Mira. How does she hide it? Levana sneered. It matters not. She'll be dead soon enough. Jason. The blonde guard descended a single step toward Cinder. He was holding his gun again, the one Cinder had dropped. Wait. Kai stole down the remaining stairs until he stood on the pathway before her. It seemed he had to force himself to meet her gaze, and he flinched at first. Cinder couldn't read him, the ever-changing mix of disbelief and confusion and regret. His chest was heaving. He tried to speak twice before words would come. Quiet words that would never leave Cinder's head. Was it all an illusion? He asked. Pain lanced through her chest, squeezing the air out of her. Kai, was it all in my head, a lunar trick? Her stomach twisted. No, she shook her head fervently. How to explain that she hadn't had the gift before, that she couldn't have used it against him? I would never lie. The words faded. She had lied. Everything he knew about her had been a lie. I'm so sorry, she finished, her words lamely falling in the open air. Kai peeled his gaze away, finding some place of resignation off in the glistening garden. You're even more painful to look at than she is. Cinder's heart shriveled inside her until she was sure it would stop beating altogether. She reached her hand to her cheek, feeling the damp silk against her skin. Setting his jaw, Kai turned back to the queen. Cinder stared up at the crimson shirt with the peaceful turtle doves embroidered along the collar. One hand still clutched her cyborg foot. She'll be taken into custody, he said with little strength behind his words. She will be imprisoned until we can decide what to do with her. But if you kill her tonight, I swear I will never agree to any alliance with Luna. The queen's glare darkened. Even if she agreed, Cinder would eventually be taken back to the moon, and as soon as Alana had her in her power, a noose would be put around her neck. Kai was buying her time, but probably not much. What she couldn't fathom was why. Cinder watched the queen fight with her temper, knowing she could kill both her and Kai in a blink. She will be my prisoner, Alana finally conceded. She will be returned to Luna and tried under our judicial system. Translation, she will die. I understand, said Kai. In return, you will agree not to wage war against my country or planet. Lavana lifted her head up, looking down at her nose at him. Agreed. I will not wage war against Earth for this infraction. But I would tread lightly, young Emperor. You have tried my patience greatly this night. Kai took in a single breath, dipped his head at her, and then stepped aside as the lunar guards trudged down the steps. They lifted Cinder's broken body off the gravel path. She tried her best to stand, peering at Kai, wishing she would just have one moment to tell him how sorry she was, one breath to explain. But he didn't look at her as she was dragged past him. His eyes were locked on the dirty steel foot clasped in both hands, his fingertips white from gripping it too hard.